Hello, and welcome to another Ouchies Batrep. Today we revisit the grudge match between the Treads and Actuators as Comstar brings the bills to the mercenaries cowering in the hills. Check it out. Attention Comstar employees, pursue the fleeing mercenaries into the countryland and eradicate all further resistance for their previous transgressions. Continue with the assault tank unit, and in addition, a couple of other pieces of equipment that we discovered in the shipping manifests are currently at our disposal. Among them is a light ray, a malak, and a legacy. I wonder how those got there. Group W now consists of just short of an assault company. Rounding out the formation is a curious configuration of an otherwise stock archer, and two of my personal favorites, Shrek BPC carriers. Setup was identical to the last mission, only reversed. With Comstar set to sweep the area, they deployed after half of Group W deployed, and then Group W got the rest of their deployment. You can see Group W set for a strong defensive line along the middle, playing right behind the church, admitted to by my opponent no less to be full of children. Nonetheless, as Comstar, this would be a fantastic moment for some propaganda posters, so I keep in mind not to send too many gauze shells through the glass pane windows, regardless of what the effect might otherwise be. I split my avenue of attack along both sides of the river. The vast majority of my forces contain units that can't cross water, so it's prudent to reduce my vulnerability to the bridge being destroyed. Group W immediately opens the far north flank as Comstar begins flooring into the bridge. The von Lunkners are on point. Given the narrow avenues of fire, the AC-20 will be in its prime, covering the bridge focal points as a sort of battering ram. A squad of challengers and a malak start down the southern flank as well, with the purifiers hoofing it out in the open. Group W sticks to their guns and lets their assaults hunker down behind a church and hillside while their Jaeger mech and EW boat moves forward to interrupt any Comstar shenanigans. But ba-boom! Right from the hip, the Tank Crew 64 sails another Gauss rifle shell right through the cockpit of the Jaeger mech. Group W doesn't take that offense quite too lightly at all, as a matter of fact, and they start opening up with everything they have against those tanks out in the distance, but they can't seem to make many of them connect. They're at quite the sweet spot right now where the Gauss rifles are within range to be able to plink the enemy, but they can't quite get a very appreciable to it against the tanks themselves. The assault group on the southern flank, however, begins tagging the challengers in kind. They have a lot more luck, and as is true for most tank-heavy forces, you start seeing that most tanks don't end up dying because they lose their armor, though that does happen because they only have one or two locations in which they usually get hit. But they start becoming mobility kills. As you can see right here, one of them's already been reduced to a 0-0 in the event of one turn's worth of fire. But he's in a nice location, and it's one of the reasons why tanks are really good out in the open, because it's a pillbox, and he'll have plenty of turns worth of shooting from then on out. And there's the poor, grisly pilot. It's worth noting that at this point, Comstar still hasn't sailed any rounds through the church pane windows. Yet. The southern front continues pressing forward, even though one of the tanks has been disabled. On the northern front, even though one of the von Lunkners has actually been reduced to a 1-2 through suppressive fire from distance, it still moves forward because that AC-20 is not going to do it any good way out here where the Gauss rifle is king. Elements from the Comstar mech forces begin tangling with Group W in the woods on the northern flank in an effort to keep side shots off the assault tanks. They're doing just well enough against the assault mechs out in the distance. Even though they're outnumbered quite considerably, they don't need to be dealing with light mechs popping more rounds into the sides. The Legacy begins using its C3 network because of the malak way up there on the southern flank, and because of it, it's able to pop 40 rounds worth of damage out on a 2-hit of 5+, I do believe. That's impressive. You've really got to be careful about that Legacy, because that Ultra AC-10, it's got two of them, and it can put down a lot of damage if you let it. And Group W got first blood, completely coring the front armor of the von Lunkner at distance. The poor crew didn't really get much of a chance to get out, having cored out nearly the entire armor in one turn. But having almost an assault lance and a half fire at you, that'll do that. And of course, this is where another issue's coming up. You have the Legacy sitting there by himself, popping rounds downrange, and even though he's doing a lot of damage, he's having to take it back in kind. This isn't a very good trade for Comstar. He's actually getting quite pummeled. It's amazing that the thing didn't die all at once. The tank crews actually began a equal exchange with the Shrek PPC carriers and took one out in the ensuing firefight. Here we can see a lone Hermes is actually giving the challengers quite a time on the southern flank, having gotten a lucky shot that jammed the turret of one of the challengers, forcing it into the awkward position of facing its rear arc. The Malak hides in the area that he can't be shot at by the assault lances. Its purpose isn't really there to be shooting anyway. Meanwhile, the bridge line begins accumulating burning wrecks from successive fire from Group W's assault lance. Will the tanks be able to make it, or will the assault lance successfully repel them by themselves? Regardless, the Legacy has to start displacing because it can't take that kind of fire as it tries to find a keyhole to shoot from over in the woods towards the north. It has the dual effect of actually displacing some of the Group W's recon lances, as they don't want to go toe-to-toe quite yet with an assault mech that is, for the most part, in one piece. The damaged von Luckner, however, pushes past the burning wreckage in order to get its AC-20 into closer proximity to the bridge, all the while Group W continues to press as much of an advantage as it can with its northern recon lance, though it becomes quite apparent pretty quickly that the Legacy still has all its guns to bear. On the southern flank, the Hermes had doubled back towards the assault lance for cover. It had taken a couple turns worth of fire from 3 challengers and is no better for it. The Malak turns to return fire in kind at it, savaging it fairly brutally in the process, but the Hermes manages to shrug it off. It's their only EW platform at this point, and Group W seems to be quite afraid of the Legacy if it ever gets its C3 network back up and in a decent firing position. The Legacy opts not to shoot at the scout mech that is assailing its side, instead going for the easier to hit number that is actually the mech way down range, the Archer that up until this point we had presumed was the long range version. I mean, it's an Archer, what else would you expect? But instead I got my best hits at trap face and realized that it was loaded to the gills with SRMs. Despite being well out of position, the C3 is still paying for itself in droves as the Legacy is able to plop shells down at 6 or 7 plus. It still connects with nearly everything. But even now, the tanks on the southern front, even though they have become increasingly immobilized, are still placing effective fire downrange. Even the warrior helicopters getting in and beating in on the Archer. The infantry continue to hoof it up the sides, but it's becoming clear I should have brought APCs. The mercenaries actually begin turning some of their equipment over to respond to the challengers that are slowly turtling their way up the open plains. If they don't have to deal with the tanks, they're certainly going to have to deal with the purifiers sooner or later. It's a bad sign when the infantry are actually keeping up with the tanks, and yet they have so much farther to go in order to become an effective force to dislodge them from the hill. The southern front keeps pushing forward, but in a lot of cases I start pushing the tanks in firing positions. What with the locked turret forcing them to face into his rear arc, I figure it's better to put a shot downrange than it is just to keep the turret pointing elsewhere. The mech forces begin pushing their way across the bridge in order to force the hand of the mercenary detachment, and to a lesser degree bait the enemy mechs to get closer to the bridge so that the Zhukov can make more effective shots at them with its Ultra AC-20. On the southern front, however, the assault mechs begin pushing down behind the hill to flush out the Malak. As you can see, he had to go and hide behind that summer home in the middle. The Archer actually moves up in front of the bridge itself to be able to start blocking and using its SRMs to good effect, and once you know it, he opens up with them and misses with every single volley. He had something like 10 or 12 rolls and missed every single one of them. Despite it, the amount of fire coming out of Group W from the fire base that they've set up is still fairly impressive, savaging the Challenger in the rear and managing to damage the Zhukov to such a degree that it's almost no longer in fighting trim. The Challenger Crew 64 is actually forced into fighting withdrawal with its front armor completely slagged off. Comstar returns fire with just about everything in the kitchen sink directed at the Archer for the most part. I mean, if it's not going to carry LRMs, it needs to die, especially at this range. It's not really an option at this range. Nonetheless, Comstar plugs it with so many holes it goes down out of spite. The infantry are getting even closer to the hilltop and village area. If they don't start dealing something with them now, they're going to have to deal with them when they're in their own hex, and that's a little difficult for most units that can't fire into their own hex. Comstar has successfully taken the bridge and begins pushing into their firebase, forcing Group W to reconsider their defensive line, with their EW platform for the most part shaken and destroyed. With Group W routing from the hill in the face of the infantry, their firebase isn't as secure as it was before, but on the other hand, Comstar has damage on all fronts and is a straw away from breaking completely. Crew 64 immediately throws the tank into reverse, throwing more shots downrange, but no longer able to stay on the field because of the force withdrawal rules. Group W, however, makes a very bold assertion by moving that Hermes that has so far eluded destruction right into the path of the bridge, creating a choke point that no other unit can get past until he's gone. It was a brilliant move on the part of the mercenary player. As the Legacy has literally no armor on his right side left, he starts moving through the woods, hoping to narrow down the amount of shots that he can get back. The Cicada leaps over the river onto the Malak that has went over to see him in kind, but I don't think my opponent realized that there's literally 3 immobile tanks out there with nothing better to shoot at. The Hermes pays for his tactical brilliance with a double tap from the Von Luckner. Twin AC-20 rounds does a number of hurt. But he earned it. Comstar's entire advance got thrown into a bit of a speed bump, and it probably bought them the game at this point. Comstar's front lines are in disarray. A lot of the heavy units can no longer move forward, and the rest are just a few points away from being in some form of forced withdrawal. Even just now, the last Von Luckner on the field returns to its brethren as a rusty scrap heap. Just goes to show a 200-year-old tank isn't impervious from being destroyed. But if the writing wasn't on the wall already, the Comstar forces have just lost another Challenger tank on the southern flank, leaving them with only a fraction of what they started off with. Group W really isn't faring too much better, but a lot of their units are still mobile, and a lot of them are still assault units capable of pushing down fire. The only thing left in Comstar's inventory that is still in premium fighting trim is the level 2 of infantry, which to this point haven't connected a single shot. But as it would be, the mech force can just kite them along and kill them. The prudent thing would be to pull back since they have no support. With that, Comstar calls it. Well, that and the store was closing, but you take one, you lose one. So, what went wrong? What went right? I love after actions because it makes it pretty clear where things could have gone better, and where your plan was probably flawed from the start. The Legacy in particular was positioned all wrong. The positioning was just poor. Sure, it made sense at the time, hunker down behind a hill and shoot downrange, but it was receiving an entire assault lance and a half of fire in return. I mean, I don't care what mech it is, that's too much fire. But the Warhammer was a brilliant exception to this, having keyholed itself into a position that was hard to assault, but yet could cover the bridge eloquently. And even though he traded his life for it, the Hermes was definitely the MVP of the game, having both stopped the advance across the bridge and fouled up so many tanks on the southern edge that they couldn't fight effectively anymore. However, there was some good positioning on part of the tanks. They only have 2 locations to hit, and in the Challenger's case, it's a lot of armor to ding through. So long as they get parked in a position, whether they want to or not, where they have a lot of targets to shoot from, they ended up doing quite well. And the infantry just took too long getting to the show. If they showed up just a little bit earlier, they would have been fine, and they would have probably made the game, but as it were, they had to hoof it across the map, and it was too little too late. And this has been an Ouchies Batrep, and thank you for watching. But if you enjoyed the Batrep, please click like down there. I appreciate it, because these things aren't that easy to make.